to quickly introduce myself for those of you who don't know. My name is James Edward Mills. I'm a freelance journalist and independent media producer based in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the native homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a land known for time immemorial as Dejop, which basically means the land between four lakes. And I am a journalist by profession, but I also have the privilege of being a faculty assistant at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach a course called Outdoors for All at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And just to give you just an ounce of background as to why we're here and what we're doing, this is actually the third author discussion hosted by the Joy Trip Reading Project. And essentially, where this all started from was my class is technically only open to undergraduate students. And because it is a university course, it's not open to the general public. And for years now, people have been asking me, wow, James, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in one of your classes. And what we typically do is we discuss issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the management of public land, but also in outdoor recreation and environmental conservation. And as you can imagine, we've got a tremendous reading list. And it just so happens, though, that many of the authors that I share with my students in my class are friends of mine. I mean, these are people that I've had the pleasure of knowing both professionally and personally for many years. And our guest today, Eddy Harris, was perhaps one of the first significant African-American writers that I've had the privilege of learning about, because in 1992, when I first arrived in the Midwest as an independent sales representative, it was recommended to me that I pick up a book called South of Haunted Dreams. And it is, as many of you know, because hopefully you did the reading, is a story of Eddy as he's making his way through the South or Southern United States on a motorcycle on a fly fishing trip. And his goal is quite literally to find racism, to understand what it is about his experience as an African-American man that relates to his sense of place and purpose in the outdoors. And I was also alerted to Eddy's work through an article that he wrote about this very topic for Outside Magazine way back in the late 1980s. So as you can imagine, we've been discussing these issues for a very, very long time. And about 5 or 6 years ago, Eddy just happened to be visiting Madison on a research trip. And I reached out to him. We became friends. We went out for coffee, and he's been very gracious of his time and his wealth of knowledge and experience to share with me his life and his stories. And I now have the great privilege to share my relationship with Eddy through this reading group. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Eddy L. Harris. Eddy, where are you right now?
I'm in a little village about 2 hours south of Paris.
Okay, and you've actually lived there for quite some time. Just to give our audience some perspective, tell us just briefly about yourself, where you're from, and how it is that you began to become a writer.
Well, I'm from St. Louis. I grew up in St. Louis anyway, but went off to school in California. I've been traveling ever since. And I became a writer because I am totally unequipped mentally and physically to do anything else. I had a job once, it lasted for 3 weeks, and I said to myself, working is not for me. And that's why I became a writer.
And
because I was already traveling a lot, I sort of slid from trying to be a novelist, a failed novelist, into writing books, nonfiction books about my travels via Mississippi Solo, which came about as a kind of antidote for 7 years of failure. I had written a bunch of stuff for a long time, nothing happened, and I took a canoe trip to jumpstart my life or commit suicide. It could only come out one way or the other. it turns out that I didn't die. I wrote a book, and the life and career changed.
Now, I didn't realize that about you. I mean, in our previous interview, you actually said that your choice was either to come up with a solution or to die. I didn't realize that you're actually suicidal at the time. What was going on at that point in your
Well,
life and your
suicidal
career?
might be a little more of an exaggeration than a reality. And I use suicidal just to emphasize that I was at a really low period in my life. I wasn't trying to really kill myself. If I wanted to kill myself, I'm totally capable of doing it in a much more efficient way than 2,500 miles in a canoe. But I was at a very low period because I'd been writing for 7 years after university and had been traveling a lot. And I thought I was going to be this great writer. I thought I had lots of talent, and nothing happened. So and I had no money, of course. So at the bottom of this pit, I decided I needed to do something. And since I had no experience as a canoeist, 2,500 miles on the Mississippi River was either going to kill me. So it was a metaphor, but it turned out to be a metaphorical suicide than a real one. Because I figured 2,500 miles in a canoe on the Mississippi River with absolutely no experience, either something bad would happen or I would emerge from this trip a different person.
So, is it fair to say that that experience was transformative? I mean, first of all, what was it like? I mean, what was it like in what year was it? Was that 1988,
No,
1989,
85. The book
1985?
Mississippi Solo came out in 88. I did the
Right.
trip in 85.
Okay. And so, what was America like for a black man in 1985? I mean, what was that trip down the Mississippi River like for you back then?
Well, that's the question that I guess is an evolutionary question, because what's America like for a black man in 2021? Has America ever changed? Has it always been as difficult as it seems, or has it always been as undifficult as a different person's reality might suggest? So in 1985, I don't know if I found a different America than I would have found in 1975, or a different America than I did find in 2015 when I took the trip a second time. And a lot of our experience is based on who we are as well as who they are, the people that we're encountering. So one of the things I have discovered in my journeys, all of them across the globe, is that I bring something to the table, and it is up to the reactor to respond to whatever it is that I bring to the table. And then it is up to me to respond to his response or her response. And in that way we have a tennis match. I toss the ball out, the ball comes back. How I react is dependent on what I'm reacting to in a certain sense, but it depends on who I am. And one of the things I have learned through all of these travels and the books that I have written is that who I am is important in the context of the encounter. Who the other person is as well. I am not responsible for that other person. She is not responsible for me. All I can be is who I am. And I am a reflection in a certain way in the other person's mind and vice versa of who that other person shows himself to be. The fact that I am black is not really a fact. I am only black because other people see me as black. That is the conclusion that I have come to in my travels and in my way of living and in my way of thinking. I am black because people see me as black, and they therefore treat me in a particular way because of their own interpretations of what it means for me to be black.
Now, in this particular part of the world in 1985, how were you treated? What was the general response to a black man solo canoeing down the Mississippi River?
Yeah, so there are two things in that question. One is, how was I treated as opposed to how a black man was treated? Because I don't know how another black man would have been treated. I can only respond to how I was treated. And I was treated really, really well. And again, it comes down to maybe what I bring to the encounter. I have no idea why people treat me as well as they do. The other part of that is a Black man in a canoe on the river, and there might be something about the river itself and the people who live along the river that changes an encounter, whether I had been Black or something else. Maybe there was a connection between me as a river person as opposed to a response to me as a Black person doing a particular thing. People who live along the river maybe saw me as as opposed to just somebody passing through, somebody who's having an encounter with their major piece of nature. Because I'm in a canoe, because I'm vulnerable, because I'm alone, because I'm on that river, people who already have a relationship with that river then see me as having a relationship with that river as well. So the encounters are based more on the bloke in the canoe, or the fact that I'm in a canoe, and the fact that I'm on that river. And that it was in 1985, it was kind of a rarity. It is less so now. People are paddling up and down, or not up and down, but down the river quite a bit these days. A lot of it apparently due to Mississippi Solo. But in 1985, there was no, I ran across one other person who was in a canoe. And when I passed people on the shores, on the banks of the river, people always called me over and wanted to have a conversation. But more about being in a canoe on the river than being a Black man in a canoe on the river.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting too, because I mean, that led to the Outside Magazine article shortly after the release of Mississippi Solo. And I think that in many ways that kind of began a national dialogue about how we relate to people of color in particular when it comes to outdoor recreation as an industry, the great outdoors. How was that article and that conversation received initially? What was the general consensus of people when they first started thinking about these things?
I'm not sure it was when they first started thinking about these things. I just happened to write an article that maybe brought some other things to light. But well, interestingly, that article is still around and people still talk about it. So I assume the response to the article in general was quite disturbingly positive. Disturbingly because it evoked the questions around why don't Black people do these things, whatever these things are. In the article, I talked about being a canoeist, being a fly fisherman, being a skier, being all of these things that we don't typically associate with Black people. And trying to understand, or at least investigate, pose the question, why don't Black people do these things? And the obvious answers are there. But extrapolating out from why don't Black people ski, or why don't Black people go fly fishing for trout, and why don't Black people canoe down the Mississippi River? Why don't Black people go to the opera? Why don't Black people go traveling to the south of France? Why don't Black people do a lot of things that we don't typically associate with Black people? But if you dig a little deeper than just the superficial, you will see that Black people do these things, just perhaps not in great numbers, and maybe in numbers commensurate with our population in the general population. So if, just as an example, skiing, so we say Black people don't ski. Maybe Black people do ski, but because we ski in 1 in 10 persons is on the slopes, one in 10 persons on the slopes is Black, perhaps that is a reflection of the general population. Another qualifier, or another element in the equation, is the expense of skiing, the expense of the equipment for trout fishing, and going to Montana whenever I feel like going to Montana to catch a trout. Who can do that sort of thing? So we're also limited not only by size of population, but also by the expense of some of these crazy things. And one final element, or another element to add to the mix, is when we pose that question, part of the question is, and part of the response is, when we say that Black people don't typically do these things, it is a reflection of us, once again, seeing a Black person as a Black person and trying to figure out well, I don't think black people should do this thing, or I don't think black people do this thing, but in fact, black people do. But it's the question is a reflection, in fact, of what my interpretation of a kind of cliche is.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about much of what I've learned about you personally, but also from many of the things that I've read, you allow yourself to be very vulnerable. You know what I mean? You allow yourself to have an experience fully prepared for whatever it is that you will encounter, good or bad. And I think that's one of the things that I really love about not only your writing style, but also your approach to adventure. When you started thinking about the prospects of doing the motorcycle trip through the South, you know, can you tell me a little bit about, maybe the mental psychological preparation of the vulnerability that would be required to be receptive to how you may or may not be treated in the Southern United States? And this is in the 90s, so much has happened since then, and certainly a lot had happened before. But what was that experience and preparation like?
Well, like as with all of my journeys, it's, the Mississippi River included, there is no preparation for these things. Going back to the Mississippi for just a second, I got the idea, I got the canoe, I took the trip. There was no preparation for this thing because I didn't know what to prepare for. The South of Haunted Dreams trip was very similar in that I had never ridden a motorcycle before. The whole idea started with my wanting to ride a motorcycle. So I bought a motorcycle. I told the guy at the motorcycle shop that I would buy this particular bike if he taught me how to ride it. He took me to the park, he pushed me down the hill, and that was the only lesson I got. And then I had to figure out what to do with this new motorcycle that I had. And I said, I'm going to go south and find out what life in the South is like. And that's pretty much it. That was the entire preparation process, learning how to ride this motorcycle and then heading south. So when you said I am prepared for whatever happens, preparation, the word prepared is a little bit of a misnomer because I'm not quite prepared for anything because I don't know what's going to happen and I don't think about what's going to happen. I just do it. I don't anticipate. That said, one of the things I wanted to do in taking the trip was to confront a South that I was afraid of. I had always been afraid of the South. We had family in Florida, and when we left St. Louis to go to Florida, I wanted to zoom across the South, especially Alabama, Mississippi, as fast as possible to get into Florida. And for some reason, I'm thinking Florida is a little bit safer than Alabama or Mississippi. Probably totally false, but those were my childhood imaginings. So my intention in taking this journey was to confront the South and see if I would be afraid the way I was when I was a kid. Now there's two journeys involved in this particular trip, and the one is me on this motorcycle. The second journey is me writing the book about me on the motorcycle. And in writing the book, I discovered that the real underlying reasons for taking this journey was to look for a kind of reconciliation with the South. I realized at what point or at how much anger and fear I wanted to confront when I went to the South. At the same time, I recognized that the anger, the fear was mine, but the anger was not, because the life I had lived up until then had not been one mired in racist behavior. So I had to concoct this story, this sort of backstory about why I'm taking this trip based on stories that I had heard, based on my father's life, based on Black people in general's experience with the Deep South. And so it was a confrontation, but at the same time, an attempt to reconcile myself with the South. And in reconciling myself with the South, reconciling myself with American history. And hoping that in reading this book, Black people and white people and other peoples would come together and recognize that it is time to make peace with the past and to leave it behind and try to figure out a way forward. Now, a question just popped up on my screen. Do I have ancestors from the South? My entire family is from the South, or was, like many, many Black people. My father's family were all based in Tennessee before they fled the South and moved to St. Louis. And a part of that story is in South of Haunted Dreams, where my father's cousin is lynched in Eads, Tennessee, and wherein my father's family, because they were all sort of métis, half white-ish, felt themselves as good as the white people in Eads, Tennessee, and then did some mishigash kind of nonsense to steal some farming equipment, and then they fled in the middle of the night and dispersed to St. Louis and Kansas City, Chicago, and Detroit and other places.
I mean, it definitely sounds like your experience as a Black person making their way north in terms of fleeing the horrors of the South. That was kind of the motivation for this trip, to confront that. And I'll ask you the same question about the Mississippi River. How were you received? How were you treated? How did that experience go?
Again, it comes back to what I present to the world as I'm traveling or as I am just being me. Because I am so sweet and gentle, I tend to attract the good things in other people. So when people see me, I don't know what they see, but I think they must feel that I am the vulnerability of me, the generosity of me, the funniness of me, the kindness of me, all of these other things. And the story that is probably the most typical of this journey was in Wilmington, North Carolina, I think. I arrived in some little shop and was talking to some guy, and I don't know what I was doing in this shop because the guy sold boats and I wasn't looking for a boat. But we had a conversation, and 20 minutes after we started this conversation, he gives me the keys to his house, tells me where his house is, tells me that there's beer in the refrigerator, that's a hammock on the front porch. I should go and make myself at home, take a shower, and that he and his partner would be home in a few hours. That's the kind of reception that I got almost every place I went in on this journey. The same thing with canoeing on the Mississippi River the first time and the second time. So in short, what I think is the key is that we all need to turn off the television set and stop listening to what we hear on the news. We all need to buy a motorcycle or buy a canoe and do these crazy things and encounter one another as individuals. When we do that, we will discover, in general, that most people are pretty okay. We will break down more barriers doing that than we will thinking and acting as any kind of group and adhering to group speak or group think. But when people are confronted with others as individuals, the response tends to come as an individual on an individual basis. And I think that is the secret to what we all need to be doing on some level, is getting out of the house, turning off the TV set, getting out of the house and meeting each other face to face.
Yeah, and that sounds incredibly simple, so simple that I have to ask, why don't we do that? I mean, is it because we've allowed ourselves to be so completely distracted by what we've heard and what we believe or what we think we believe, that we will talk ourselves out of very positive experiences doing remarkable things?
Well, my suggestion would be that it's partly fear. It's partly the reaction to fear, which is safety in numbers. And we all of us tend to regroup around the group, whatever our group is. And therefore we adhere to a kind of group think. And when we stay inside of our group, everybody else becomes the other. And when everybody else becomes the other, it is easy to clicheify, if that's a word, to clicheify everybody else. including ourselves, because then we fall into the trap that we, as Black people or as Asians or as Indians or as anybody else, we do this thing, which then limits us from doing this other thing, whatever this other thing is. When we get out of the house, when we get away from groupthink and get away from the cliche, we allow ourselves the liberty to be who we really want to be and discover all kinds of things. Because in testing ourselves, in getting in a canoe, just because I want to canoe down the Mississippi River, it's a test of myself and my inner self, as well as the physicality of me. But it is also a test of everybody else to find out what's it like when I meet some new person. Staying at home, staying inside, watching TV, adhering to, even if it's not staying at home, but adhering to this kind of propaganda that everybody else is hurling at us all the time is very, very limiting. And I think that is the best way, I'm not going to say the only way, but the best way to break free from a past that has cluttered our minds with who we think we are as opposed to who we are.
So then there's the question of how do we reconcile the recurring reality?
Say that again, please.
How do we reconcile the recurring reality? And specifically what I'm talking about are incidents like Ahmaud Arbery, a young African-American man, seeking outdoor recreation for a jog and is confronted by three white men with guns who believe he did not belong where he was, doing what he was doing. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, that is probably the toughest question. How do we allow ourselves to do certain things when we know that there is the potential for danger out there? I just ran across a story that happened in September. A Black man jaywalking in Southern California gets killed by the police. Now, the police have a responsibility to decide whether or not to interact with that person. In their recorded conversation, there is a discussion. One says, no, leave the guy alone. The other says, no, we're the police. He's jaywalking. We need to confront this guy. The cops are white. The jaywalker's Black. They didn't have to do what they did. At the same time, and I'm not trying to blame the victim, the jaywalker responds in a way that provokes. He responds in an aggressive way that provokes an aggressive reaction from the police. There's a tussle, and sooner or later, the Black guy is dead. Now, I'm not suggesting that because the white people stopped the Black guy, in this case or in the other cases, the many other cases that have occurred to us. I'm not suggesting that we acquiesce. I'm not suggesting that it is our fault that we get killed. I am suggesting that we have to find a way to diffuse the situation. If the police, if the aggressors, if the white guys in their pickup trucks are not going to diffuse the situation, we have to find some other way than just standing on our civil and human rights to say, yes, you don't have the right to stop me here. I have the right to be here, and it's none of your business what I'm doing. But we have to find another way to diffuse that situation. I don't know what the answer is to that one. There is danger out there because there are white guys in pickup trucks with pistols and shotguns. And sometimes you just can't diffuse that situation and somebody ends up getting hurt. At the same time, perhaps we have to find a way to swallow pride sometimes and say, there's guys with guns and I should be on my best behavior to deal with these guys with guns. I don't know how else to articulate the fact that there is danger. I do have the right to do what I need to do. And yet, how do I find that sort of equilibrium that allows me to do what I do, but to do it safely?
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's all about balance. Trying to figure out exactly what the calculus is of protecting one's own sovereignty while at the same time protecting one's right to live.
Yeah.
And to not be subjected to violence or otherwise abused. And frankly, I think a lot of what you've done is demonstrated that you can do, atypical, um, how did you put it, non-cliche things, okay, and still do them safely and still do them with style and verve and everything else that makes it an interesting and exciting story. And I think that kind of gets us to another book that you wrote called Native Stranger, where you went to Africa, and to have an experience as a person of African descent, as an American going to Africa. And in previous conversations, you and I have agreed, and I've actually adopted this myself. You don't describe yourself as African American. You describe yourself as Black. Tell me and the audience a little bit about how it is that we relate to our ethnic heritage as Black people from America in Africa.
Well, first, let me go back to those situations where a Black person is being threatened by white people. If we look at most of those situations, it's more than one white person assaulting a Black person. So those white folk have again adopted groupthink, and they get together before they confront the individual. If those people who wanted to confront the Black jogger, for example, or the Black guy crossing the street, if each of those aggressors had gone individually, I almost guarantee it didn't happen, it didn't work so well in Florida, but most of the time, an individual confronting another individual, the diffusion factor is there. It's when we react as a group that we tend to find strength in that group for the positive and very often for the negative. And somehow I think we just have to stop being part of groups. Segueing from there into Africa, yes, it is easy to look at my Black skin and say, "Ooh, there is an African American," when in fact, my Black skin and an African's Black skin are only physical attributes that are similar. But my culture is not African. My culture as an American may have some roots in Africa, but I'm not an African person. If you told me to move to Africa, stay there for the rest of my life, sure, I could adapt, but it would be an adaptation process. I would even enjoy myself, but it would be an adaptation process. I would have to learn to be African. I'm an American. The fact that I am Black is a physical attribute, the same as I have a gray beard and I'm bald and I'm old and I'm tall. You can call me a bald American if you want to. You can call me a gray bearded old American if you want to. Black American does not, the terminology does not bother me. But because I am not African, I don't understand why anybody wants to make that link between my being Black and my African roots. Any more than, because if you trace my ancestry and other Black people's ancestry as well, you will likely find other sources for our genetic material. And I've traced my roots not only to Africa someplace, but also to Wales. Nobody ever calls me a Welsh American. How come?
So, what was your experience like in Africa? How and I keep asking you the same question because that's the way you relate with the world. How were you received?
Yeah, just the same as I'm received almost every place I go. People like me. I don't know why, but people just do. Partly it could be my outlook, and it could be the way I treat them, what I bring to the table of the encounter. I don't know why, but I tend to have many more times positive experiences than I have negative experiences. Which is not to say I'm Pollyanna, which is not to say that all of my experiences are wonderful, because there is danger in this world, and sometimes I have to confront that too. But it also could be my way of confronting difficult situations. I don't know why, but partly what happens in Africa, on just looking at Africa exclusively here, because I'm Black and because I'm an American, what the African sees is my Americanness before he sees my Blackness. I then am the big brother coming home like the prodigal son. Where have you been? We're happy to see you. And then what can you do to help us out? But there is an extreme generosity that happens in Africa. And I don't know if that's because I'm an American, because I'm a traveler, or what. But I discovered more generosity in places where the people are so poor that to share is a burden. And yet people were constantly sharing with me. And that could be part of their culture. It could be something that I bring to the table. It could be the fact that I'm an American. I don't know. I'm not even sure I want to know what it is. I just want to take advantage of, and not in a profiteering sort of way, but I want to take advantage of other people's generosity so that I can share my generosity with them too. Whether my generosity is time or an occasional meal that I can share somehow with them too on my part, buying the meal or providing a meal or something. But I want to give the opportunity for their generosity so that I can then share my generosity, or vice versa. I'm not sure which is chicken and which is egg.
And I heard something recently that reminds me of what you just said. Always add before you ask. So be prepared to contribute something before you ask for something. And I think that that's exactly how your African experience was, exactly how every exchange you and I have ever had. And it's always been a matter of being able to bring something to the table with the interest of sharing it. And I think that that's probably one of the things that has made you as successful as you are as a traveler.
It could be, and I'm not sure about the ask part. It's not that I'm going someplace looking for something in return for my generosity. It is that I offer myself, and just as a natural outgrowth of that offering, people then offer too. Or I'm in a position where people see a traveler and want to offer something first, and then I can do the adding, the addition part. I don't know how it works. There's some weird alchemy that happens when you're traveling, and either the experience is good. And one of the reasons too that I travel alone is that I think the dynamic would be completely different if I were with someone else. Totally different traveling in a group or with another individual than as an individual confronting an individual.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets back to that group think that you were talking about a moment ago. I mean, and I think that there is an intrinsic value in being a solo traveler, in being vulnerable, in being prepared to be injured, if only, to be embarrassed or to be uncomfortable. And, I'm curious if we could, perhaps encourage people to do more of that, and what it would take, other than your great examples of from all your many stories, what will it take to get people to be comfortable being that vulnerable so much so that they would be prepared to sojourn into places that they might otherwise go?
I don't know, but fear is a big limiter. And the fact that we are, in general, afraid either of circumstance or the other, whoever the other might be, or the possibility that there is danger out there, it limits us. And those are the things I think we just have to get past. I don't have words of wisdom for it, even for how to get past the group think thing. But I don't, I know I'm an American, I know I'm Black, but when I'm traveling, I don't rely on those things to dictate how I respond to other people. It's just an outgrowth of an accident of birth. I just happened to be born in America. I happen to be born black. And now I have to use that as one of my sets of tools, let's say. And sometimes it works yes, sometimes it works no. But that's all I have in my toolkit. Well, not all I have, but it's a couple of the things that I have in my toolkit. But I don't rely on them exclusively and approach people as I am the American, I am the smartest, richest, greatest person in the greatest country on the planet. I'm just another individual talking to another individual, trying to discover who this person is while revealing myself. And that is part of the vulnerability. The fact that I'm willing to reveal myself to strangers while they reveal themselves to me. It is all give and take. And the more we give, the more we can take. The more we take, the more we have to give. And that, I think, is the secret to success as a traveler, but also simply as human beings.
And I think that's even true in the COVID climate that we're in right now. I think that even, this exchange that we're having right now, I think is a gift to, anyone who's curious about these things, because once the restrictions lift and things get back to normal, we're all going to be rather vulnerable because we're out of the habit of interacting with strangers. And I think that if we can go into it with a spirit of vulnerability, we can all have much more positive outcomes moving forward. We've got 15 minutes left, and I would love to entertain questions from the audience, especially if you've read the book, and everybody should have, but it's not like I'm going to hold you to that. If you can either unmute your microphone or raise your hand using the handy features in the reactions below, or put your question into the chat stream. This is a very bright and impressionable group. I'm sure you've got all kinds of questions. Does anyone have an opportunity to, well, here's our first question from Kendra. Do you still have your motorcycle?
No, my mother sold my motorcycle.
So how do you get around the part of France that you're in right now?
Well, I sold my car as well not too long ago, but I used to just get around by car. But because I live in a particular village that's not too far from a reasonably sized town, there are buses that I can take. And if I need to rent a car, I can rent a car. And I can also borrow cars from people. But the main modes of transportation are bus into town and then trains from the city to every place else. Okay. And because it's France, the transportation system really works, and it really works well.
Okay, other questions from the audience, please. But I'm also curious, and we've talked about this before, but I'd love for you to share what changed in the 30 years between your original Mississippi solo paddle experience in 1985 to 30 years later in 2015. What were the appreciable differences in your experience, the natural environment of the river, et cetera? What was different?
The biggest difference was I got 30 years older, and the journey was 30 years harder. Other than that, there was not a big difference in the river and in the people, except that the first time, the real differences was inside of myself and the reasons for taking the journey. And the first journey was to encounter Eddy Harris, to encounter myself basically alone for 2 months, and to see who this person was, if I liked this person, how he would react to other people. The second journey was more to discover America and to see how America would react to me. We were on the cusp of the Donald Trump era. Obama was still president, but you could feel the sort of backlash against Obama's presidency in the air someplace. Trump had not announced, I don't think, his intentions to run for the presidency, but you could feel a kind of Trumpism in the air, and I wanted to discover what those encounters I would have along the river would be 30 years later, in the era of almost Trump. And again, what I discovered is partly what I bring to the table, but also the fact that America is a good and generous place. And Americans are good and generous people. And when I encounter folk out in the middle of nowhere, they tend to be good and generous. And the typical the emblematic experience on this second trip was I was in a cafe or a trading post in Illinois, just south of the Wisconsin border. I think I might have still been in Wisconsin. And I stopped off at this trading post to get a cup of coffee. The long and short of it is somebody came in, saw that I was in a canoe, thought I didn't have any warm clothes, basically went home to find warm clothes for me and brought them back to give me a stack of warm clothes. I didn't ask for warm clothes. I didn't need warm clothes. When I told the guy I had plenty of crap in my canoe, he ignored my protestations, went home, found a stack of warm clothes, and came back to give them to me. Those kinds of encounters I had all the time, not about warm clothes, but the generosity of people that I met along the river. And again, it could be that I'm encountering river people because we're all right there within 30 meters of the river. Or it could be that I'm just running across the generosity of America. And I prefer to think of it as the generosity of America.
I prefer that too. Linda actually sent a message to me via email asking, what did you think of the Obama presidency, and how was that appreciably different relative to, what we just experienced in the last 40 years and the 12 years prior to that?
Well, the Obama presidency didn't do a whole lot for me, except in contrast to Trump, in the sense that Obama was way cooler than Donald Trump, way smarter than Donald Trump, way more articulate than Donald Trump, and just a better human person, in my opinion, than Donald Trump. As president, we forget that Barack Obama was the president of America and Americans, and not only of Black America. If we were looking for a Black person to be a much more powerful advocate than a normal and ordinary president would be, I think we misplaced our optimism in Barack Obama and in the institutions that he was enabled to manipulate. And clearly he had obstructions at every turn when he thought he wanted to do something like universal health care. My problem with Obama and something like universal healthcare is that Obama, as articulate as he is, as suave as he is, he never made the case for why it was a good thing for us. And that's what I want a president to do, not just Obama, but a president to explain to me why a particular policy is good for all of us and not just for some of us. We tend to get presidents who are Democrats, presidents who are Republican, and who then point their policies toward, if you're a Republican president, toward the Republicans, if you're a Democrat president, toward the Democrats, as opposed to saying, okay, I am now president, I am no longer Republican or Democrat, I need to figure out what's going to be good for all of us, and here is why I think it is so. And we don't get presidents who do that very often. So that was my problem with Obama. I love Obama as a human person. I love Obama as a symbol, because symbolically he was fantastic. I love Obama for his African Americanness, which should have sparked a debate about what does it really mean to be African American. In his case, with an African father and an American mother, there is in him a real African Americanness that is not in the rest of us necessarily. We could have had a conversation. My problem with America very often is, and American politics especially, is that we seem to refuse to have the necessary conversations that will push us forward.
Laura Dirks has a question specifically regarding the book. Laura, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask your question that you put in the chat stream?
Sure. First of all, I just said thanks for being a terrific storyteller. I just kept wanting to read about your travels and all the people you encountered and that you were allowed yourself to be so vulnerable with. The one guy that you met at the gas station that was such a jerk to you, I was wondering, since you met so many good-hearted people or people who really wanted to explain themselves, white people in particular, I was just curious if you saw that coming. And when you said to him, "You don't even know me," did he have any cogent response to that?
He did not have a cogent response to that because I think deep down within himself, he realized that that was true. Was I expecting it? Not in specific, but in general, I think that kind of encounter was what I was expecting throughout. And I was rather surprised initially that I never ran across that guy more than that one time. In Mississippi solo, there was an encounter with a man in a diner in Wisconsin. And that guy makes a joke using the word nigger, which I did not appreciate. Because of the way I responded to him, he recognized, and he was not being particularly aggressive or racist. He thought he was being funny. The way I responded to him evoked from him a response that he probably wasn't expecting either. I left the cafe, he came out of the cafe, and we had a conversation about what he had said. What I hoped would have happened, what I would like to have happened with the guy in South of Haunted Dreams was a similar reaction. You don't even know me. And then he, in response, could have made an effort to get to know me. But all I can do in a situation like that is leave him with my final parting words and hope that they have a reaction. I was stopped by the police once in St. Louis, one black policeman and a white policeman who not exactly roughed me up, but because I refused to show them my driver's license, I'm just a pedestrian, they were accusing me of having stolen something from a grocery store. Or that I fit the description of a person who had stolen something from a grocery store because I was carrying a motorcycle helmet, which they thought looked like the thing that I could have stolen. I don't know what their story was, but they somehow got my driver's license out of my wallet, recognized that I was not the culprit that they were looking for, gave me the license back and said, "Sorry, pal." To the black police officer, I simply said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Now, I could have gone into a big tirade. I could have tried to, I don't know, make him feel something. But again, my position is not to be aggressive with other people, but to say something that makes them think, that leaves a kernel of reflection in the back of a brain. That's all I can really do. And then it puts the spotlight on that person to be who he is going to be. So whether the cop had a reaction to what I said, whether the guy at the gasoline station had a reaction, like the guy in Wisconsin, there's no guarantee. But that's all I can do is to not only try to diffuse the situation, but also to leave a grain of something that leaves questions in their minds, as opposed to just being the angry, aggressive, méchant black guy.
So thank you. Let's see, Benita, would you like to ask your question? Unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Sure. So many Americans are afraid to travel to countries where they don't speak the language. And the US isn't really that great about teaching languages in school. My daughter, I had to pay for her to go to after-school program to start to learn French in elementary school, so that by the time they started teaching it in high school, she was a lot better off than other students, and French isn't spoken in my household. So, how do you navigate in countries where you don't speak the language? I've been to China and different places. I found ways to survive and to make it, but a lot of Americans will not travel to countries where they don't speak the language.
Yeah, well, first you have to determine that you're a traveler, and then you will go wherever the travel goes, and not just because they speak English in those places. To not go someplace because they don't speak the language, whatever my language is is extremely limiting. And again, it falls onto the fear factor. Fear is limiting. The fear of not being able to communicate is limiting. People have been able to communicate without knowing the other person's language forever. It is easy, in my opinion, it is easy to fall into the bounty of the other when you make an effort. And the effort doesn't have to be inside the language. The effort can be the presence, just showing up someplace, especially if you're traveling to out of the way places. People are so happy to see you there. It's like going to prisons. I go to prisons a lot to do lectures and readings and things. And prisoners are just happy that somebody took the time to come see them. I think we forget that fact when we're traveling, that people are happy to see us.
I'm going to leave my last question to Kyler Abernathy, who's my college roommate. Who I don't see him often enough, and I'm so glad to see him on this call. Kyler, ask your question, please.
Hi, James, thanks. And Mr. Harris, thank you very much. Your book, just amazing, very powerfully written, really enjoyed reading it. One thing that particularly struck me, given current events, or recent events, you had mused about Confederate heroes and monuments a bit in that book. And I felt that, you know, or at least what I took away from your writing was that you were kind of ambivalent about them. Given everything that's gone on in the last year or so, do you have any difference, or are you still of the same attitude about those?
Yeah, my attitude is still ambivalent. I lived in Richmond, Virginia a few years ago, and I like Richmond, Virginia. And down Monument Avenue, there are statues to Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, and there's even one to Arthur Ashe that they put up for some crazy reason. I don't know what to say about them, except that to tear them down is yes, they should probably not be there. But again, the problem isn't the statues. The problem is in our refusal to have a real conversation about it. Because we do the knee-jerk thing and say Robert E. Lee was a Confederate, let's take his statue down, which then provokes an aggressive response to my response to take the statues down. No, it's culture, it's not, it's history, then we can't talk about it. And the more we are unable to talk about it, the more we retreat again into this group think mechanism, and we just can't see the person that we're supposed to be talking to in any kind of human kind of way. And that's what I wish the conversation about those statues could have evoked. We could talk about Robert E. Lee, who was a fabulous soldier before he left to go home to Virginia and be with his country, as he called it. We could talk about him as a military genius of some sort, which he was. Or we can talk about him as a Confederate who was defending the dissolution of the Union. There are many ways we can talk about Robert E. Lee or Jeb Stuart, and almost anybody except Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is just despicable, no matter how you look at it. Because we're all nuanced, and yes, we cannot destroy history. History is what happened. But we don't need monuments to the past. Nor do we need to take Mark Twain out of the library. And it's part of the same mechanism, where somebody 100 years ago did something that seems offensive to us now, and therefore needs to be erased from our consciousness. We cannot erase them from our consciousness, but what we can do is talk about Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn's use of the word nigger, or Robert E. Lee's defending the Confederacy, or Jefferson Davis, or anybody else who in some way or other is defending slavery. We can talk about what does it mean for us today. Evanston, Indiana, the other day passed a law in the city to do reparations within that city. The outcry about it was virulent and sharp. And part of the problem with the outcry is that we can't have that conversation to underscore why reparations may or may not be necessary, who may or may not benefit from the reparations. And the knee-jerk reaction is nobody owns slaves anymore. My family didn't own slaves, without being able to recognize at what point 300 years after slavery or 150 years after slavery, we are still profiting from, some of us are still profiting from the existence of slavery. And until we can have those kinds of conversations, we just can't move forward as a country. And that's what we have to do. We have to be able to talk honestly about what we feel, what we think, and find common reality so that we can push forward.
Thank you.
And with that, Eddy, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I still have time. I have more whiskey, so I'm in a hurry to go.
And I frankly, you and I need to have a visit soon so we can actually enjoy a glass. I want to make sure that I'm respectful of everyone's time. I committed to an hour. And as much as I appreciate Eddy being more generous of his time by willing to stay on a little bit longer, I am going to call it. But I want to also to say thanks one more time to the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies for providing the Zoom link. Also our sponsors, Ceres Innovation and Outdoor Research, provide the financial support that allows us to make sure that all of our authors receive a modest but still very important stipend in compensation for their time with us today. Thank you so much for coming out for this conversation. If you missed anything, it'll be posted online so you can watch a video, hopefully later on this week, definitely by the weekend. And I also want to invite you all to join the conversation next month when we'll be talking to Drew Lantham, author of the book, The Home Place, and a fabulous story about the Black experience while birding. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming out for the Joy Trip Reading Project, and I look forward to seeing you again next month. Check Goodreads for updates, and we look forward to seeing you again.